Welcome to a discussion on gender, caste and class. As you know, human beings have a tendency to not only live in societies, they also tend to form themselves into groups and then also make these distinctions between themselves and other groups through various practices of distinction, markers of identity, so on and so forth. There's also unfortunately a tendency in human societies to grade human beings into different social categories which are very hierarchical in nature and which are power based. Today in our studio we have Professor Maitri Chaudhary, who is a professor in JNU. Let me start asking her by just elaborating on these three categories that we want to discuss today, which is gender, caste and class, and perhaps bring out the nature of hierarchy and difference that is within these categories.
Thank you, Kiran. What is interesting is that when we were students, we were familiar with the concept of caste and we were familiar with the concept of class. The concept of gender we were not familiar with at all. The only time we discussed gender was in the case of grammar. So you had feminine and neuter and masculine gender. I make this point to just bring out the issue that concepts emerge in societies at specific points of time, and the manner in which gender, caste and class has to be looked at is also in the context of the specific historical context within which they arise and acquire a certain shape. The other point I would like to make is that very often, as you just said, that they refer to social groups. Now, the problem is that gender, caste, class do refer to social groups, but at the same time they are also conceptual tools. So on one hand, when you say caste, you mean empirical entities, it could be a subcaste, it could be Jats, it could be Brahmins, it could be Khatris or whatever. When you refer to class, you actually talk about empirical reality, so you would talk about the bourgeois, or the proletariat, or the middle class, or the working class. When you talk about gender, you very often talk about men and women, or transgender communities. And very often then people will ask you, taking the idea that these are empirical realities, but why are you only talking about women? Why are you not talking about men? Why are you talking about this community and not this class? So this is something I think all of us should be aware with when we use these concepts, gender, caste and class, that they have two aspects to them. One is the empirical reality to which they refer to. The other is that they emerge as concepts. And we have to simultaneously discuss this. I want to make this specifically this point because when my generation started off discussing gender, we didn't use the word gender. We used the word women. And it was women's studies, which now has been re-inscribed as gender studies. And the central issue that we were asking was invisibility. We were asking that why is it that so many women work but they are not counted as women workers. We were asking that so much sociology is done on college students, why not on college girls, or we were basically asking why are we invisible, and we wanted to make ourselves visible. And how do we make ourselves visible? That we do more and more work on women. But the problem that struck most scholars very soon after was that the issue was not just of visibility, the issue was why were women invisible? Why were so-called lower castes invisible? Why were certain classes invisible? So then the issue arose that they were invisible because the concepts or tools which we had to capture social reality were inadequate to capture them. For instance, if work only meant paid wage labor, then obviously women in the unorganized sector, home-based sector would not be counted as work. If work just meant paid employment, then work within the houses would not be counted as work. So this is the first point that I would like to emphasize, that when we talk about these three concepts, you have to remember that they are talking about two different issues. One is the empirical reality, but built into it is the concept from which it arises.
Well, that's a very nice way to introduce, because I think one thing that has come up on the issue of gender is that these are in a way borrowed conceptual tools from the West to study the Indian reality, which is far more complicated. And in that sense, how do you see the relevance of some of these perspectives that have been used to look at gender issues in India? And do you see any changes in the context of contemporary India?
This is in a certain sense a kind of question which haunts most social science and sociology in India is, are these Western concepts, how do they impact us? And in the case of gender, I find this very interesting. Because what we find in the early writings of Indian women's study persons as well as activists of the women's movement, that very often they would say, for example, we are not feminists like our Western counterparts, our feminism is different. Women organizations like All India Women's Conference or National Council of Women in India or Women Indian Association, they always mention this, that we are fighting for rights of women together with our men. Okay, so I'm making this point because you said that they're borrowed from the West and our reality is very complex. In contemporary West, they are recognizing difference because the Black women's movement, ethnic communities, and now they talk about this terminology of intertext, the question that these are all connected. I just that particular word which is used, that it is that you can't look at just gender, you can't just look at class, or you just can't look at race or caste, but you have to look at the manner in which they are connected. My argument would be that in the Indian context, we always looked at this interconnectivity. We never looked at just women or just class, because in the early debates on gender in our country, the issue of community identity came about. So you had issues, debates on question of civil codes and community codes. You had debates between rights of women versus rights of religious communities. So you had the issue of identity coming in very early. The question of caste and gender was central to much of the 19th century social reform debates. So when people took up the issue of women's issues, they had to negotiate with the issue of caste, because the linkage between caste and gender was intrinsic. Likewise with the question of class. I just want to give one example. The first 1938 plan document, which is called Women's Role in a Planned Economy, which is one of the subcommittees which was part of the 29 subcommittees which the Indian Congress had instituted before independence, was on women. And almost 280 pages of the document are documenting working class women, which means that there was a great awareness about diversity within. But this was all political. People were not writing books. It was not academic women's studies or gender studies, And it's only in the contemporary context that when you put it as gender, caste and class, and in the West they put it as gender, race and class, that you find that this is being done within the academic world of protocol. I just want to argue that in the Indian case, the political reality had to negotiate with diversity. They are talking about multiculturalism in the West now. We had to negotiate with unity and diversity right from the beginning. So our political reality articulated a certain kind of frame. But you are absolutely right, it is in the contemporary context that, that this is being framed in this way. So I would hesitate to say that the Western ideas have influenced us to formulate, but there's a more dynamic relationship, and sometimes we were trying to negotiate with this diversity without having the language which is being used now in the Western academia. So we didn't have a language of difference, but we were trying to speak about difference in our own way.
Well, you're very right about our not just contemporary reality, but the Indian reality being what it is, that we are beset with differences and plurality of all kinds. But this again brings to the question that at one level, when you're talking about a larger discourse of gender justice and so on, you also have to deal with the issues of citizenships and rights. So that's where the problem, I believe, there's a certain disjuncture between how you articulate that and translate into a more equitable system where the differences are taken care of. I mean, to give an example, how would one conceive of a uniform civil code, for instance, given the fact that women are situated in their different contexts? So, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I'd sort of go back to what you were saying earlier, that this is not just a question of difference, this is also a question of hierarchies, as you mentioned, you know. So here we are not just celebrating differences, the manner, say, in which multinationals celebrate their diversity. So you have your Benettons saying you have different colors, and you're so, you know, we are not celebrating diversity simply as a market tool. We are been always negotiating with diversity and hierarchy. So to the question that you ask about uniform civil code and the fact that women are differentially located, we have to then sort of break up a concept like community. Say you have different communities in our country, you know, we have a Hindu community, a Muslim community, various kinds of communities which are there. Now within that community, you're right, suppose the issue of gender justice is raised and a particular community says that we do not do this in our community, this is not allowed in our community, and this has happened in the past. When you had the Hindu Code Bill debate in our parliament, there was a great opposition to it, saying society will break up if this is done. When there were demands for changes in various practices within the Muslim community, you had similar kind of opposition which took place. Now when this kind of opposition takes place, we, from a gendered perspective, then we have to unravel about what this community consists of. That the community, and this is where I mean we have to move from empirical to the conceptual, that these communities are gendered, by which we mean that in this community there is also a hierarchy. So some section, that is men, are usually more powerful within this community, and they can speak on behalf of their community. They can say we in our community. So when we had, for example, the Shah Banu case, you had a kind of conflict between and within the community. So you had women, Muslim women activists, feminists who came out and supported the judgment, but they were dismissed as people who do not belong to the community. The community says they are no longer part of our community. Likewise, when you had say issue of the Hindu right-wing political parties saying that this custom, sati for example, the Deorala case, is accepted within a community, and if there are Hindu women activists who oppose it, they'll say they are not Hindu at all, they are just feminists. So what is happening here? There is a power dimension within the community. So when we say the community is gendered, we are talking about the hierarchy of gender within it, and this would be true of caste. I mean, even within the Dalit movement, interestingly, you would have conflicts between one group which says there is discrimination even within Dalits, and there would be others who say no. And now we have to say who is speaking. You know, so the gendered, and of course in the question of class, which we can probably come back again later to. You know.
This also brings, I mean, in my mind at least, the fact that now that there is recognition of these pluralities, what is, how do you see that affecting the larger movement possibilities as a women's movement? Because I think earlier in the 70s, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a sort of a unified projection of women's rights and women's issues, but the fissures within, I mean, I think that's an exaggerated word, but the differences within itself are sort of dissipating some of the energies that have been gathered over the period.
I would sort of differ a little bit to that extent, that whenever we talk about a kind of consensus or a universal kind of movement, it is the logic of the movement which questions that universality. So it is probably, we should not see it as a decline or a weakening of the movement. When we say that earlier there was a very strong women's movement and now there isn't, I would sort of reframe it a bit, and I would go back to the past, because my argument is that right from the beginning, when it came to questions of gender, class, community, caste, we did have this issue. I'll give you a very simple example. When we had the demand for the right to vote before independence, you had women's groups from the Muslim community who argued for community awards. The women's organization, say All India Women's Conference, said that this would weaken the women's cause. Now, there were others who argued that unless you recognize different forms of diversity, the nation will be weakened. So you have two positions. One is that you ignore diversity and make the nation strong or the universe. Other, you acknowledge this diversity and make it. So I wouldn't say that in the 70s there was great unity and now there is less unity, but what has happened is there's more recognition of diversity. So when we say that the concerns of the middle class women is not the same as the concerns of the working class women, the concerns of the Dalit women is not the same as the concerns of a so-called upper caste women, the concerns of a minority women is not the same as the concerns of a majority women. Correct. So we are recognizing the distinctiveness of their community identities. Along with the distinctiveness of the community identity, we are not forgetting to look at the universal aspect of the dimension, that is their gender identity. So take an issue like maternal mortality rate, and this would be something which would be affecting women, women's health, women's role within the household. These are universal issues. Feminization of poverty, feminization of employment, these are issues which would be affecting all of them. But along with that, they will affect them in a particular way depending upon which class or which caste or which community which arises. So we have to negotiate both the universal dimensions of their discrimination with their particularity form of discrimination. I'll give you something a very recent issue, say globalization. Now we know that globalization is impacting all women. Yeah. But is impacting different women differently. Yeah. So you would have women who are in transnational corporations, new women, people, CEOs, bank heads, emerging middle class women who have been liberated in a certain sense, and a recognition by the corporate sector of the need to promote women, which is part of the strength of the women's movement. On the other hand, globalization is also affecting other sections of women by maybe you have unemployment, you have loss of state support for health requirements, you have various kinds of social welfare measures being withdrawn which are affecting women. So you have the same process, and that is where I go back to the concept of gender as a conceptual tool, that therefore we can say that globalization is a gendered process, that it's something which affects men, women differently, it affects men and women from different castes and different classes differently.
I'm glad you raised the issue of globalization, because I was just going to ask you that given the situation of high degree of market orientation,
right.
How do you think the gender justice as an issue has changed?
No, I don't. There are a couple of things which has happened. One is that, say, like I was just going back to when my generation, that is 30 years back, started working on gender. 1975 was declared the International Women's Year. There has been the last 30 years greater visibility. Everybody knows what women's issues are. Everybody knows the word gender. That has happened. That is a strength. That is the strength of its institutionalization. But the logic of institutionalization very often is that it often de-radicalizes, that very often you then start becoming part of the package, so to say, so it benefits doing gender. It becomes more important for corporates to say that we are gender sensitive, which is a good thing. But at the same time, we also lose out on certain other aspects de-radicalization. And by de-radicalization, I don't just mean that we speak less of women, but a kind of institutionalized way of speaking of gender. Whereas in the Indian historical context, like I've been repeatedly saying, issues of gender justice have been very closely linked with issues of caste and class justice. But what often happens in the institutionalized format is that gender gets separated from caste and class. So women becomes a top priority, or caste becomes a top priority. Class has generally retreated from public discourse, So that is a huge problem that has to be addressed. And especially people who are involved in issues of women's studies or gender justice must address this issue squarely. you know, because only by looking at this issue in this fashion, we would be in a position to rectify in a certain sense what we do. I just want to move off a little from this direction to the issue of the relationship of gender, caste and class, not just historically but conceptually. Very briefly, that we must not see gender, caste and class as three distinct entities. As gender is produced, caste is produced and class is produced. You are probably as familiar as I am with the fact about caste rules of purity, marriage and descent. As you are familiar, in a traditional caste society, the worst thing that can happen is that a so-called lower caste man marries an upper caste woman. So the strict rules of sexual control over upper caste women coincided with access of sexual services to lower caste women by upper caste men. What it means is that the codes of controlling caste, the codes of controlling class are structured around gender. As it is in the case of race. It would be all right for the white slave owner to have children by the black slave, but it would be unthinkable and demanding really serious punishment if a black slave had a relationship with a white woman, you know. So I bring this example to dramatically show why these three concepts are not three different entities but are interlinked. Just a small comment about honor killing. Why honor killing still takes place right in contemporary India. Now, it's strong punishment and it is taking place because it's a violation of gender, violation of caste and violation of class.
Well, I'm very glad that you did bring this interface. I think in fact I felt that all through the discussion Professor Maitreyi Chowdhury was clearly bringing out this interconnection or the interface between these different contexts in which each of them are embedded. One last question that I wanted to raise, if very briefly if you could. You did mention that the class has not been part of the discourse, but lately with globalization, the middle class has now again emerging to be a point of discussion for scholars and for writers of on India particularly. Do you have any brief comment to make on that?
No, you're right. With globalization, there is a resurfacing of the middle class and a changed identity for the middle class, because you have a changed idea of capitalism itself. But along with it, there is a greater focus on labor, which was not there 10 years ago. So there's a lot of scholarship because of the nature of labor mobility and capital mobility, flexible labor, migration patterns, because it's not just the middle class who are migrating. Domestic workers, women workers are one of the largest migrating groups globally today, you know. So it has also brought attention back to questions of labor, you know. So what is interesting, there's a contestation or sometimes assertion of caste identities, sometimes focus on class, you know, and of course these entities being gendered, you know, is a constant.
In either ways, I think again the point that comes right through and through is the interrelationship between these three conceptual categories as well as categories of hierarchy and difference. With this, we thank Professor Maitreyi for coming to the studios, and I thank her again on behalf of the sociology faculty. Thank you.